So we talked about innovation, diverse perspectives being really critical. Now let's talk a little bit about leadership, because we need leaders to be able to create those conditions to take that next step forward. And for that, we're going to look at data that we've shared with a couple of you in the past, but not all of you, around Project Oxygen. So this is a big leadership study that was done over 10 years from Google employees across the globe. And they were looking at what makes for an effective leader. So they weren't looking at the cat videos that you've been downloading and you know who you are. They were looking at the employees inside of Google. And so what they were trying to answer is do leaders matter? And if so, what makes for an effective leader? And so the answer to the first question, which is good for all of us in leadership positions, is leadership matters. So we can check that one off the box. You're still going to be gainfully employed. Yay, yay, yay. But now let's look at what makes for an effective leader. So they identified 10 areas. They added 2 new ones in 2018. I'm just going to hit these quickly. You can take a picture of it, or we can send out some of the handouts, or you can look at the video later on if it's useful to you. But here they are. As I go through them, be listening for what's the common thread that runs through all of these. So the first one, good coach. Most effective leaders are really good coaches. They empower and they avoid micromanaging. They create an inclusive team environment. They're productive and goal-oriented. They're good communicators, both in written and oral form. They support professional and, increasingly important these days, personal development. They articulate clear vision and strategy. They play a key advising role. And the 2 new ones they added, they find are even more powerful for effective leaders. Number 9 is a strong collaborative decision makers, making decisions with, through, and in partnership with others. And finally, number 10, collaborating across the organization. We're just doing some work in New Zealand in which schools were really focused really solely on their own school, even though they had other schools in a very close proximity they could reach out to. So how do we start thinking about collaboration across the organization? You'll hear David talk a little bit about that, because what he's done in his district is to bring the entire system along. So those areas are really important. And if you think about the thread that runs through all of those, it's about relationships. So we're grounding our research in innovation, organizational change, this idea about high quality leadership, and that leads us to this notion around social networks. So if relationships are key, we've got to start understanding these in deep ways. So I'll start by telling you a little story that some of you have heard before. And it's this idea called the Wood Wide Web. And basically the way the Wood Wide Web works is that trees have roots. Like if you go out in the woods, trees have roots, and these roots are crisscrossing and they're connected by fungi. So actually underneath the ground, there's an interconnected, interdependent biological system out in the woods. And what's super cool about this is scientists have been able to show that if one tree in a wood is under attack, it sends out chemical signals through its roots, which connect to the fungi, which go to the roots of the other tree, effectively warning that section of wood that they're under attack. The second cool thing that happens is that, as shown in this particular graph, a social network of trees, if you will, the bigger green circles out around the edge, those are the older trees. And as they die, what they do is they send out their resources through their roots connected to the fungi. And what can happen is those saplings that aren't getting enough sunlight in the middle here, like these smaller green ones, they get those resources so they can get stronger and still continue to grow and support the overall system. I think this is such a powerful idea for us building our own systems. How do we create systems of care and support? How do we reach out and nurture one another, particularly in these times where we're all struggling in some ways? And so for us, the work that we've been doing are looking for these opportunities that are hidden in plain sight, whereas relationships are really critical and show us potential for leveraging our own strengths. So this quote by Margaret Wheatley really drives us. In organizations, real power and energy is generated through relationships. And the capacity to form those relationships is more important than tasks, functions, roles, and positions. We are in the era of the relationship. That is going to be front and center. It's far more important than the title or the letters behind your name. So that means we've got to think about formal and informal systems. The metaphor that's driven all of our systems for many, many years looks like this. big, all-knowing, all-seeing red eye at the top, and a separate set of other little boxes down the bottom, each doing their own discrete thing. But in the work that we do, the work that the core connections is grounded in, we think about the world in much more informal systems, where these colors of these dots here reflect the organizational level you see in the formal system. And the lines between them reflect the sharing of knowledge and resources. And so interestingly, while in the formal system, there's the all-knowing, all-seeing red box at the top, that individual is actually quite marginalized in a social system. So what this signals to us is that there are leaders in our systems that are doing important leadership work that don't show up in the organizational chart. And for any of you that have been site administrators, myself included, I would go and do a wonderful presentation, talk about all the cool things I think would happen. And then I would walk out to my car in the parking lot and see a smaller group of teachers meeting. And that was the real meeting, right? So we've got to be thinking about these informal systems. This idea about social systems and social influence comes back from the early 1930s. This is the first published sociogram of social networks. This is done by Jacob Moreno. And what he was showing is that in 1930, there were a bunch of runaway girls in the Hudson Bay camp for girls. Each of these big circles represents a cabin that the runaway girls are in, and the little smaller circles with the lines between them represent runaway girls. And this is the first time we're able to identify social influence over behavior documented. So we know that's true. We know that social influence is really powerful, and yet somehow we pretend that it doesn't follow us into the schoolhouse door. So for the work that we're doing, we're going in and mapping social networks. You'll see some of those from Arcadia in a couple minutes here. But when we do that, and this is a map of Hamlet, when we do that, we can actually start seeing some patterns. We can start seeing bigger nodes in the middle that were really well connected, like Hamlet or Claudius. This is a friendship network. We could see folks that tend to be more on the periphery, and we can start deeply understanding how social structure impacts outcomes. In the work that we've done, the research that we've done, we've shown how social structure impacts leadership. We've shown how it impacts access to knowledge, resources, practices, research evidence, student achievement, and a host of other kind of critically important areas that all of us care about as leaders. So let me illustrate this in a really clear way, and then I'm getting it ready to hand it off to my dear friend, David. So we collected some data in a couple of elementary schools, and the question we were asking is, who do you turn to in sharing best practices? So let me show you school 1 at the top and school 2 at the bottom. These schools are only about 3 miles apart from one another. I tell you that because they're sharing a similar student population with a similar teacher population, so we're going to take those variables off the table. Let me use the top one as a teaching tool. Each little dot you see represents a teacher in this particular elementary school. You may also know there's colors there. They are colored by the grade level that they work in. So in the top school, those blue ones might be the 3rd grade, for example. The line between the teachers there represents the sharing of best practices. You may notice also off to the left, there are a bunch of little dots. That's not like a printing problem we have at the university, although we do have those. Those are people that are completely isolated, meaning they don't turn to anybody for best practices, nor does anyone turn to them. It's lost information, lost knowledge within the system. Now, take a look at the school on the bottom. Everything I said is also true. Each of the dots represents a teacher, or the colors represented by grade level. So now I'll ask you just to predict in your head which school you think is doing better. This is not a trick question. So just think for a moment. I'm going to guess most of you are saying school 2, and you would be absolutely correct. School 2 is outperforming school 1 in any number of different kinds of metrics. So the district did what districts typically do, which is they came in and said, oh my God, we need to do a whole bunch of specific professional training for these teachers. Everyone needs to be on page 10 at 9:30 in the morning. And they engaged in this very long, intensive professional set of learnings for these particular teachers. Now, in the end, what happened is that school started to do a little bit better because professional development and learning is really critical in our work. But what the district missed was that they were layering that knowledge and those resources on top of a base state of relationships that did not support the uptake of that knowledge. So what they did is they took a relational issue and they tried to solve it through using knowledge, technical approaches. That's typically the way that educational systems often respond. So in the work that we're doing in the Core Connections with the Core Collaborative and with Arcadia is we're actually flipping the script. We're saying, let's lead with the relationship and make sure we have the really critical professional development that follows. So it's not one or the other, it's both and leadership with an organization and a foregrounding of the importance of the relationships. And when we measure this and we look at this in a bunch of different ways, we can show you all kinds of different configurations. This is another district. The blue nodes represent folks that are principals. The red nodes represent those that work in a central office. If you look at it quickly, you can see there's a big gap between these two groups. That's not uncommon in systems. And it's around getting advice and improving outcomes, which you would think systems would want to work together in a cohesive, coherent, aligned way. You'll also note there's a goodly number of isolates off to the side. One other curious fact you may be interested to know is that that little red one in the middle that's holding the two groups together, that guy retired. So this effectively broke the system into two.
Oh no!
Okay. We can also look at change over time. Here's time 1, time 2, time 3. We can measure metrics on this, etc. We can really now do a deep dive into the sets of relational connections. So now imagine we're thinking about climate and culture from a leadership and an innovation standpoint, but we're also thinking of it as a relational standpoint. And that combination we think is really quite powerful. We can also look at the kid level. This is social network work we've done in classrooms, looking at kids that are being served with special education. So what I want to do is I want to try to bring this all together and have my friend and colleague David share a little bit about Arcadia.